Welcome and thank you for joining this new webinar on Psychoanalysis and Racism, which is part of our new series called On the Road to Cartagena, preparing us for the upcoming IPA World Congress that will take place in July at Cartagena de Indias, Colombia. My name is Patricia Olguin, and I'm currently an analyst in training from the Chilean Psychoanalytic Society. Today, we will have an interesting discussion about racism from the point of view of two distinguished psychoanalysts who have done a deep research on the subject. Probably since its beginnings, psychoanalysis has tried to address the phenomenon of racism. Freud himself refers to the narcissism of minor differences in his book, Civilization and its Discontents, where he postulates that it is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so as long there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. Freud himself also experienced racism through Nazi persecution and anti-Semitism. Racism was and continues to be a way of expressing hostility, prejudice, and superiority through acts of violence and discrimination. Probably the silence around these acts allows them to continue and to be perpetrated. What happens with racism within our consulting rooms? How can we address our own biases and that of our own institutions? How can we address, should be neutral when we witness situations of discrimination that occur in reality and not only as a part of the internal world of our patients? These are some of the questions that come to my mind regarding this topic and that maybe we'll be able to discuss through this seminar. Before handing over the presentation to our panelists, I will explain briefly the format of this webinar. This webinar has two sections. In the first section, each of our two panelists will give a 7 to 8 minute presentation. The second section is a question and answer portion devoted to free exchange of selected questions and ideas with the panelists and attendees. You will find a questions box in the right side of your screen. If you would like to ask a question, please write it in the box. You can post your questions throughout the whole course of the webinar, from the very beginning. But please remember that all questions will not be answered until all the presentations have been completed. Now we are ready to begin. I will introduce our first panelist. Jorge Bruce is a psychologist from the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, master's degrees from the University of Paris, and member of the Peru Psychoanalytic Association. Professor also in the Universidad Católica from Peru. He's columnist in a newspaper called La República, former director of Community and Culture Board of Directors of FEPAL and of the editorial committee of Caliban, former member of the board of an executive committee of the IPA, and former chair of CAPSA. He is also former chair of the program committee of the IPA Congress of Vancouver. And actually, currently he will be a keynote speaker in Cartagena's Congress, now in July. He also wrote, author of several books on psychoanalysis and society, among others, and the latest of which is the republication in Penguin Random House of Nos habíamos choleado tanto, Psychoanalysis and Racism. The title of his presentation on this webinar is Racism, the Elephant in the Consulting Room. Thank you, Jorge.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Santina. Thank you to the IPA for organizing this webinar for this subject that it's so important for me, and I'm very, very happy and proud to share this table with Michelle and Patricia. I'm sure we are all having a very important opportunity for learning. I mean, especially myself, of course. I use this cliche, the elephant in the room, for the title of my presentation, having in mind the long silence of psychoanalysts regarding racism. The verb regarding works here in a very suggestive polysemic sense. It means with respect to, but also and perhaps mainly meaning look, gaze. This is what Edward Said in Freud and the non-European dares to call a negative hallucination, using a concept from Freud himself. There is an ongoing debate, at least here in my country with some colleagues, about the right term to describe this phenomenon. Denial, negation, blind spot, and so on and so forth. The fact is that one way or another, we arrive very late, we psychoanalysts, to this crucial cause of pain, injustice, and even cruelty, and, as I will try to demonstrate, death drive. Even Freud, who wrote many great essays on civilization, war, and so many different aspects of culture, masses, never address, I mean, in an essay, in a book, the anti-Semitism, which he was a victim all of his life, or racism. He had some reasons for that, needless to say, because he was very worried that psychoanalysis will be in a bad spot if he raised this point. But I think the task is for us now. In my country, Peru, during the 80s, we endured a weaponized internal conflict. In the year 2003, the Truth Commission or Committee, which was appointed by the government, issued a public report, and there we learned that the conflict with the Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, guerrilla, had killed 70,000 persons. Just to give you an idea, in 50 years of violence with the ETA in Spain, ETA, there, you know, for me this was astonishing. In 50 years, they killed only 1,000 persons. Well, in Peru, in a decade, 70,000 people were killed. And the fact is that nobody was aware of this horrific dimensions of the tragedy. But we also learned that around 80% of the victims were peasants who spoke Quechua, which is the language that came from the Incas. They were inhabitants of the poorest regions of the rural mountains, the Andes. This tragedy took a decade, and the massacres were carried out by both Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, and the armed forces. The point is that while this was happening in the most developed urban centers, most of which are located on the coast, life went on as if death was not ruling the regions of the descendants of the Incas. The historian Cecilia Mendez published a text about it entitled Incas Yes, Indians No. This lethal racism led me to think of a death drive underlying that indifference to the life of what Giorgio Agamben called the Homo sacer, namely the slaves whose life could be disposed on without explanation in the Roman Empire. I published an article about this hypothesis in the weekly column that I write for the national newspaper, La República. Recently, from December 2022 to February 2023, there were a series of protest demonstrations because we changed government. Again, it was in the Andean areas, in the Andes, in places like Andahuaylas, Chincheros, Ayacucho, Juliaca, the same places of the killings in the 80s. This would never have happened in Lima. Notably, says the report of Amnesty International, the police and military only use live ammunition outside the nation's capital, even as Lima experienced similar levels of protest as other regions. The government ordered, or at least allowed, extremely violent repression using weapons of war against unarmed people, many of which were just bystanders, people that were walking around. And a lot of them were young people. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, Amnesty International, the New York Times, and IDL Reporteros, which is a very, very serious organization here in Peru, issued reports, among others, saying that their investigations revealed without a doubt that the 60 deaths, there were 60 killings from December to February, that occurred in that period had been the product of two factors: the use of weapons of war, and, in the words of Amnesty International, who presented yesterday the report, lethal racism. The virus of racism, of death, and I am paraphrasing Andre Green and his theory of narcissism of life and death, was circulating from the conquest, passing through the colony until reaching the Republic, which has turned 200 years old in most Latin American countries. It is a mutant virus whose strains adapt. You know, this is, of course, an analogy with COVID. I would dare to say that today we suffer the consequences of a variant as hypocritical as it is serious. Hypocritical because racism is expressly forbidden from the beginning of our Constitution, the law of laws. But those articles are what we call in Spanish letra muerta, dead letter. They are very, very right, but they mean nothing in practice. Unlike what happened in other countries, even in some countries of our region, in Peru, a majority of Peruvians are the discriminated. We are closer to Rhodesia or South Africa in the 50s or in the 60s than to Argentina, Chile, or Uruguay. Serious because we seem not to have learned the historical lesson. What has happened in recent months is a compulsive repetition of what happened in the 80s with Sendero Luminoso. The same indifference, the same rationalizations. They are terrorists, vandals, drug traffickers. That's the way the government justifies these killings. The same desire not to know among the political and economic elites and a large part of the press. As the Spanish writer Javier Cercas rightly says in response to a Skype question from the Peruvian writer Gabriela Wiener, a racialized person, an active combatant in pursuit of equal rights for people like her, particularly women, the evil Spaniards, say Javier Cercas, who conquered America are your ancestors, not mine. And he was right. It's now our responsibility. We have to stop, blaming the conquest, the Spaniards for what is happening here. They started, but now it's us. Likewise, I have titled this presentation the way I did because I am interested in highlighting the paradox that analysts throughout the world have fallen since Freud himself into a series of variants of denial or even negative hallucination regarding racism. Furthermore, there is a resistance on the part of analysts and our institutions to recognize the damage and suffering specifically linked to racism. We have tried to work on these consequences by assimilating them to other pathologies. We prefer to talk about narcissistic fragility, fanaticism, vulnerability, aggression, or hatred, as if it were an exclusively individual problem, ignoring that from the moment a patient enters in our office, they come to our minds with a baggage in which the traces not only of his personal history or her personal history, but of his place in the social structure. We also have a responsibility that goes far beyond the boundaries of the practice. We have and must make contributions from our unique perspective to the social debate. This thunderous administrative silence from analysts prevents us from realizing that our institutions are the reflection of this racialized discrimination. I'm going to give you an example of this. In my society, some time ago, it was necessary to hire a secretary. A colleague wrote an ad for a secretary, couldn't be a man apparently, of, I quote, of good looks, buena presencia, we say in Spanish. A lawyer friend of mine, an anti-racist activist, called me immediately when he saw the advertising in a at that time we used a newspaper for this, that this notice violated the law. When I notified the colleague in question, he assured me that he was unaware that he had never intended to discriminate against anyone. But this is exactly what I mean. The law prohibits it because in the codified language of a society made up of citizens of different categories, who in practice are not equal in rights or before the law, secretary of good presence means a white woman, not brown, not black. It is evident that we are alluding to unconscious acts, and I do not have to question the good faith of the person who assured me through a series of rationalizations that his intentions were other. We all know that hell is paved with, that's Dante, no? Good intentions. Even in a country like mine, where the vast majority are discriminated, our psychoanalytical society, my psychoanalytical society, is very good looking. The same is repeated throughout all over Latin America. I have seen it because I've been in most of the countries, you know, for congresses, webinars, conferences, etc. The first edition of my book on psychoanalysis and racism, Nos habíamos choleado tanto, which is very hard to translate. It's a paraphrasis of the Ettore Scola film, C'eravamo tanto amati, we have loved each other so much, was in 2007, 4 years after the Truth Commission report. In a country with a considerable intellectual production dedicated to racism, perhaps the largest in Latin America, from José Carlos Mariátegui to Aníbal Quijano, Alberto Flores Galindo, Gonzalo Portocarrero, it was a great surprise that my text, and I apologize for this, what I'm going to say, that my text had a success of sales and comments, some of them critics, of course, that it had, to the point that in 2019, the prestigious publishing house Penguin Random House offered me a new edition, no longer one of the multiple reprints it had in the small university press in which it initially came out, arguing that it was not just a bestseller, but a long seller. You will understand that this very persuasive argument was impossible for my narcissism to resist. So, of course, I accept. I would like to say a couple of things about this. It seems to me that the reception given to the book by the general public is due to the fact that it was perhaps the first time that a central issue of our social bond was dealt with from an eminently subjective perspective. This was something that was found very, very rarely, very scarcely in the great works of historians, sociologists, or anthropologists. Social scientists usually approaches flagellum from a socio-historical perspective, of which I haven't reached a lot, of course. However, I felt the urgency to enter the field of subjectivity and intersubjectivity, to the problem of the other, to the disturbed alterity that divides and classifies us. Regarding the latter, I would like to say that when I wrote the book in 2007, I was less aware of the place of privilege from which I did it. It was, as Christopher Bollas said, the unthought known. Since then, a series of interesting processes have occurred in my country. A series of testimonials from racialized people have been published, not exempt from a thinking gaze, but above all, as they are writers, most of them, they have helped me to better position myself. People like Marco Avilés, who wrote De Donde Venimos los Cholos, the aforementioned Gabriela Wiener in Huaco Retrato, the illustrator Rocío Quillahuamán in Marrón, that's the title of the book, Brown. I would like to say that it is impossible to read these books and remain intact. But analysts know that the unconscious, just like racism, has an amazing plasticity when it comes to getting rid of the obstacles to its enjoyment. However, this willingness to break the silence of pain and humiliation seems to me a very hopeful sign. This is my last page. The other reason I think this book caught on was the way it was written. A long experience as a weekly columnist, I have done this for many, many years. I continue to do it in national distributed newspaper, has taught me to write across the borders of our cenacles and reach a majority of readers without lowering, at least I try to, without lowering the level of ideas. Finally, I would like to refute the well-known argument that taking care of the affairs of the police is not psychoanalysis, but a citizen's task. I am persuaded otherwise. We psychoanalysts have a valuable tool, very valuable tool, or, a lot of tools that can and should contribute to debates such as prejudice, discrimination, or racism. It is excellent news that the IPA has appointed a committee against prejudice, discrimination, and racism, but it was in 2022. So one wonders why it has taken us so long to do so. I was speaking with my friend, the chair of it, the Argentinian psychoanalyst Isabel Feinstein, and he was asking himself the same question. The mere fact that the aforementioned committee is as late as 2022 speak volumes about this widespread attitude. In Peru, for example, the denial has led us to horrifying tragedies, where the vast majority of the victims were racialized people from the high Andean areas. Likewise, identification with the aggressor makes it possible to understand the self-discrimination of many people who abide by the cultural mandates referring both to canons of beauty, for instance, in omnipresent advertising, and to tolerate daily microaggressions. I have given clinical examples of this in other texts, like Psychoanalysis Criollo, which Michelle reminded me. My proposal is that we should not only focus on the problems of our societies in the broad sense of the word societies, but also on our psychoanalytical institutions and on our own internal forum. I think that, if necessary, we should sharpen our work tools and get out of the post-colonial subjection in which are still stuck. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jorge, so much for your interesting presentation. I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussion because it's very, so many examples of racism and discrimination. Not only, I think, in Peru, I think in a lot of countries and in South America in general. So thank you so much. Now we will have Michelle, Anna, and Stephen presenting. Michelle is a graduate of William Alanson White Institute of Psychiatry, Psychoanalysis and Psychology, and a psychoanalyst practicing in New York. She is also professor of English and Latino and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers University, and the founding and executive director of Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. Originally from Jamaica, West Indies, she graduated from Yale University with a PhD in American Studies. She is the author of Black Empire, the Masculine Global Imaginary of Caribbean Intellectuals in the United States, 1914 to 1962, and Skinner's Race, Psychoanalysis and the Black Male Performer. Recently, she has published articles on the intersection of race and psychoanalysis in such journals as JAPA, Contemporary Psychoanalysis, Psychoanalytic Dialogues, and Psychoanalytic Quarterly, Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and Psychoanalysis of Culture and Society. The title of her presentation now is Standing at a Crossroad, Race and Intersectionality in a Psychodynamic Context. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for joining our webinar on racism and psychoanalysis. I'd like to thank Mariano Rupertus, the coordinator for the IPA's webinar cycle on the road to the Cartagena Congress, for his original invitation, and I'm honored to be joining Dr. Jorge Bruce, whose notion of a hybrid psychoanalysis I'm fascinated to learn more about, and my gratitude to Dr. Patricia Olguin for agreeing to serve as our moderator, to Santina for helping us to work and understand how to operate the webinar. So along the shores of the coastal territories that were the first sites of encounters between Africans, Europeans, and Indigenous Americans in the 16th century, a new kind of subject speaking many new kinds of languages emerged. The historian Ira Berlin described these subjects as Atlantic Creoles, those who by experience or choice, as well as by birth, became part of a new culture that emerged along the Atlantic littoral in Africa, Europe, or the Americas. I open with this historical reminder as a way to locate myself in our New World geographical context. What began as encounters and formations of race on the coasts of Africa, Europe, and both the insular and continental Americas expanded to become the Creole Atlantic context of at least all the European, African, Indigenous, and Asian descended peoples that came to constitute the Americas over 4 centuries of colonialism and slavery. This history precedes, but also shapes, the founding of psychoanalysis in late 19th century Europe. And it precedes and shapes the work of the Black American feminist legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, whose influential writings on intersectionality at the end of the 1980s drew attention to the particular experiences of American women of African descent. Now, while Crenshaw's immediate context was the United States, I believe her insights are applicable to the situations of Black subjects throughout the Americas, and indeed to racialization processes more generally, both throughout the New World and in the Old World context of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Now, those who know of Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work tend to focus on her highlighting of the multidimensionality of Black women's experiences across the seemingly very different domains of law, feminist theory, anti-racist political practice. She argued that what all of these domains seemed to miss was the different cross-cutting axes of race, gender, class, etc., shaping Black female subjectivity. Crenshaw's insight was that Black women living at the intersection of both racial and gendered constraints were invisible in their multiple state existence. That's the crucial idea, in their multiple state existence. They were forced instead by external systems and structures to inhabit one space and one identity position, a Black subject or a female subject, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm emphasizing today, however, is another profound aspect of Crenshaw's argument, one that I think bears directly on racism and on how we might think about racism psychoanalytically. Crenshaw went beyond identifying Black female subjectivity as a complex, multidimensional unfolding of identity. She was as intent on describing what prevented, or to use our psychoanalytic terminology, defended against seeing Black women as living complex lives. The problem of a female Blackness lived as an invisible intersectionality is less about the difference of her multidimensional identity from everyone else's. Because to be honest, all humans live at that intersection. So instead, it is much more about what prevents some other humans and human institutions from seeing and encoding the ontological multidimensionality of Black women's lives in our epistemologies and in our institutional structures and laws. Crenshaw described that what makes Black women's human multidimensionality invisible is our indebtedness to what she called a single axis analysis and way of thinking. She states further, with Black women as the starting point, it becomes more apparent how dominant conceptions of discrimination condition us to think about subordination as disadvantage occurring along a single categorical axis. Crenshaw continues, I want to suggest further that this single axis framework erases Black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and sex discrimination by limiting inquiry to the experiences of otherwise privileged members of the group. Highlighting single axis frameworks as conceptualizations that limit inquiry, Crenshaw moved her readers into the realm of epistemology, producing a theory of the mechanisms that shape how we come to know what we think we know. This single axis structure is particularly prevalent in subjects who are privileged, producing distortions in what we think we come to know about other types of humans. Crenshaw identified whiteness and maleness as identities premised on a single axis, syntonic with each other, and undergirded by an entire apparatus seemingly designed to thwart the recognition of other kinds of subjective identities, states, and experiences. The importance of Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality lies in her identification of this single axis framework as a mechanism, one could even say a defense, that keeps the intersectionality of Black women out of view. I describe this as an invisible intersectionality in order to emphasize not just the multiplicity of identity. As I said, everybody has a multiplicity of identity, but more importantly, what keeps our recognition of it at bay? What keeps it out of awareness when we see it or don't see it in other people? Crenshaw's idea should not come as a surprise to psychoanalysts. For what is intersectionality but not another language from a different experience and with a different genealogy for describing the dissociative phenomenon that creates multiple self-states? The American psychoanalyst of dissociation, Philip Bromberg, shared the same broader cultural moment as Kimberly Crenshaw. His notion of the multiplicity of the decentered self parallels Crenshaw's observations regarding the intersectionality of the Black woman's experience and how that intersectionality shapes her sense of identity. What is different, however, is that in Crenshaw's analysis, whiteness is named and analyzed in a way psychoanalysis hesitates or even refrains from doing. Whiteness as a discourse, a way of life, an institutionalized social framework is perhaps one of the most powerful single-axis frameworks and dissociated narratives of self, constricting American identity. This insight, which motivated Crenshaw to confront legal theory, comes from her being, as a Black woman, the very figure that calls forth the dissociated intersections of racial, gendered, and sexual material in the history of the Americas. The Black woman is in a profound, ongoing historical enactment, or we might call it a transference, with dissociated whiteness, by which I mean whiteness as a narrative framework built from and on dissociation. Dissociation can create elaborate narrative structures of containment, and much of Black feminist theory springs forth from the realization that it is the Black female subject who thwarts a single axis framework most persistently. Don't know how to think about her, right? She finds herself constantly in an unconscious enactment with the dissociated material that must be kept out in order to keep the privileged white framework of the subject, that narrative of self, intact. Adrienne Harris recently pointed our attention to Thomas Ogden's distinction between an epistemological and ontological psychoanalysis. The former, the epistemological, he argues, focuses on understanding the meaning we make of our experience, its sources, traumas, confusions, losses, identifications. The latter, the ontological, focuses on helping patients become alive to and make new meaning of heretofore unknown aspects of the process of experiencing itself. I would argue that cross-racial, intersectional, socio-psychoanalytic moments of encounter are precisely when an ontological psychoanalytic clinical practice needs to kick in, precisely where an epistemological psychoanalysis is not enough. When our theories do not hold, when the metapsychological frames the psychoanalytic field has constructed are too narrow, what we as clinicians have left to rely on is a dyadic encounter that stages being together as an intersectional lived experience. Kimberly Crenshaw imagined this as standing at a crossroads, about to be impacted by forces coming from multiple directions outside of the self. I believe we need to place psychoanalysis and ourselves as psychoanalysts at that crossroads, engaging race and racism anew as structures of the unconscious relational mind. Thank you so much for considering these ideas this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for your presentation. I don't know if you like to, it's in Jorge and you have questions for each other before we start opening the questions from the public?
Sure. I have an initial one I can start with, Jorge. I was so interested in your emphasis on the subjective perspective, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. In psychoanalytic conversations in the US, there's a lot of discussion right now about what people often call the social turn. And the direction of the conversation tends to go, oh, we are moving away, or the fear is like we're moving away from the way psychoanalysis thinks about the subject into the social. But then when race is talked about, it always stays at a more social systemic level and never moves into the subjective. And so I was really, struck when you talked about that being what you felt was a particular intervention that you were making, was this focus on race through the perspective of the subjective experience. And so I just was curious to hear a little bit more about that.
You have to turn on your microphone, Jorge. You are silent.
I'm sorry.
There.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Yes, yes, I was, this was progressive, but I always knew that racism was central problem, central, I could also say an infection, a disease in our social bond. But we deny it in many, many ways. One of which is saying, for instance, we're all of us, how do you say, mestizo?
Mhm.
Is there a word in English for mestizo?
Yes.
Half breed, how would you say that?
Say mixed, you know, or all kind of like when I said we all live at the intersection, you know. Yes, there's a similar idea. A kind of, we also describe it as a kind of color blindness, right? You know, we all have color, no one has color. Yeah.
Right. So there is no race. Okay.
Yes.
Or even the worst, racism is it goes in both directions, etc. No? Which are all ways of not dealing with the main problem and avoiding it. As I was saying, we have a lot of literature written by great thinkers, but from this social, historical, or even economical perspective. But very little has been written here about the I'm going to your question, to the subjective situation. So how people, for instance, how people feel this discrimination. And one of the chapters of my book is about publicity, for instance. If you see, even now, Peruvian publicity, you know, in TV or in the internet or in the magazines or the newspapers, and you will say that we are living in Scandinavia, because all models, you know, are blonde, etc. I mean, men and women. And the only moment when they are not is when they are assigned to something which is in a lower position. No, the guy who puts the gas in the gas station, or the person who cleans the house and is so happy because her master gave her a very good product to wash the clothes, like that. So the publicity reproduces our different categories. And when I discuss this in public with publicists, and they say that it was aspirational. And I say, yes, I understand that we can, you can aspire, you can wish to have a better, you know, blender, or a better rug, or a better car, or a better house. But how can you say that you can aspire to have a better skin or a better face? So this is a very good business for the surgeons, aesthetic surgeons, you know, who white, especially women. And I said, yes, but can you imagine this girl that sees all this publicity and then sees herself in the mirror, and she thinks she's ugly. She thinks that she doesn't fit in the beauty canons, and well, and this is not easy to discuss even in my cabinet, in my consulting room, because I have, of course, and I always had, and I want to keep doing this, people that are racialized and work together. And so I will tell you just one case that I wrote about this many years ago. And this person came from Huaraz, not really the city of Huaraz, but a small village. And his father was the manager of the only bank in this small town. So in that town, they were, you know, the most important people in the town. So they were considered white. But when he came to Lima to study his university, and it was a national university, Universidad de San Marcos, and very quickly, he told me that they make him feel that he was not white, that he was Serrano, that he was somebody from the mountains, which is a way to say Cholo, Indian, brown, whatever, no? Door color, said the racists here. You know, the color of a door, not a white door, of course, a classical brown door, no? So when I tried to get this into the transference, it was not easy because he said, no, I came here because I know that you are not like that, exactly, because he had reading my articles and maybe one of my books. And I said, well, it was really, really hard to work that, but I think that's the task, that's the job. Yes. And also, I think we have to go with this public. And that's what I try to do in my books, in my articles. I've seen that you have written a lot of things about it also. And I think if we don't work as psychoanalysts in the subjective perspective of this, we will always stay, in the, not in the surface, but in the historical, in the broad meaning, but not in the way it makes people feel inferior, feel pain, and things are changing now. Luckily enough, as I said, there are more and more people who are talking about this, writing about their own situation, not in theory, but I'll finish here. One young woman from Peru who lives in Barcelona, Rocío Quiahuaman, who wrote Brown, Marrón. This is a beautiful small book of her experience. And she tells us that when she was in a very, very expensive store in Barcelona, she went she was curious about what they were selling there. And the guards from the store followed her all over the place, because in Spain they say sudacas, people from South America, and they are considered thieves or whatever, they prejudice. And the guy was following her. So at what point, and she's very funny, she turned her gaze and she looked him into the eyes. She stared, and the guard stared her. For a moment, they looked each other without blinking, and she said, "It would be romantic if it was not racist." I love this girl.
You said, you've been using a term I use often, racialization, and I was thinking about, in the US also, often people think of racialization as the process that is applied to the person of color. And I think one of the things that we are both saying in our work, and why I particularly like dissociation, is even in the case of your patient, the clinical case you described, we need to start, psychoanalysts, I think, need to start understanding that racialization is also when you think you are not of color, right? Because at some level, we all have color, because we're all human and we're all raced, right? But not in the way of, so therefore race doesn't matter, more that, what does it mean? Can psychoanalysis offer anything about the racialization of whiteness and understand whiteness itself as a process of racialization with differences across different regions, but its own racialization process? And I think that's what that's what I found so helpful about this, this other point of intersectionality, was that idea that if you really believe in the intersection, then racialization actually also impacts this invisible thing that we can't seem to see, which is the racialization of whiteness,
Yes. Now, let me ask you, Michelle, because I'm very, very interested for some time now, but I haven't read I have read very little about intersectionality and all the Kimberly Crenshaw theories you were explaining. I think this is a very powerful concept. It has to do with power, of course, and yes, the intersectionality of different categories, women, Black, gender, sexual, as you said, and but I wanted to you explained that very well, but I wanted to ask you, why do you think, Michelle, it has been so hard for us psychoanalysts to accept this this huge and enormous fact that racism is a great problem you know what, I always tell my Latin American colleagues, in a very friendly way, of course, each time we talk about discrimination, I mean, you talk about it because I don't do it, you always put the example of the Holocaust. The Holocaust. Holocaust, of course, is the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. But Michelle, I mean, we have tragedies in our countries, you know, and they are working, they're happening now. So maybe this Holocaust example is a way of avoiding the question. I don't know. There are so many ways of going to this dissociation that you rightly called. What do you think about this resistance of psychoanalysis to accept this?
You know, how I try to think about it is that there is a limit or a narrowness in how people think about the human at some level, and it's very unconscious. It's not even, yes, by the time it gets enacted as racism, it has violence, it has aggression. But even underneath all of that we establish ideas of what we think the human is, but that only includes a certain sense of the group, right? It's back to something Patricia, I think, quoted from Freud of the narcissism of minor differences, where you can only love who's in by setting someone out. We carry notions of the human, especially in cultures that are predominantly white, where whiteness is the kind of dominant culture, where we literally just, it's almost like a kind of unconscious blinder. And so everything that happens to groups that we feel an affinity with as somehow associated with whiteness feels like, oh, this is something happening to humanity, right? But then the things that are happening to the people we have unconsciously somehow put outside of humanity, somehow that doesn't count. That's racism, that's happening to those particular people, but that's not happening to humanity, right? And it's this very strange split, it's strange, but it's historically grounded, and it's a very severe split. I think psychoanalysis is somewhat, what's the word, mixed up in that too, right? That the way that we think about the psychoanalytic subject, was shaped by people who were predominantly living a certain kind of experience. And so unbeknownst to themselves even, they were defining the human who has all of these unconscious structures in particular ways, right? And it takes the few psychoanalysts over time in our different countries who are speaking from a different perspective. I'm often referring to Frantz Fanon to say, wait a second, not all of these unconscious structures kind of fit with my experience, but I'm human too, so maybe I need to theorize from my experience as a Black man, right? And the more the more there are psychoanalysts theorizing from these different experiences of the human, and I don't just mean that as just even that the person of color has to do the theorizing. At the end, when I said I think psychoanalysis period need to put ourselves at the crossroads, I think we need to be reading people who are having different experiences and using that to develop our theories, as I think you and I have been doing, right? Broad in the sense of like, well, what are the actual multiple human experiences that are happening, and how does that redefine how we think about the human,
Yes, that reminds me of something that happened some years ago. I was invited to Gramado in Brazil, in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul. It was the annual Congress of the Psychiatric Association of Rio Grande do Sul. Gramado is a beautiful place. And I had the last, they give me the great honor of giving the last conference to close the Congress. And it was about racism. And I knew that in Brazil, half of the people are what they call pretos, Black people, half of the population. And there was a huge auditorium. There were 500 persons, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, students, and there was not one Black person in the. So I say it in a very, very, polite way and courteous. And I say, well, listen, from here, I see who's here, and I have to say that I'm kind of amazed that you have half of the population and there is no one here Black. And Claudio Aiziric, who was a former president of the IPA, was the first one to speak. And he said that Jean-Paul Sartre had came 50 years ago to Rio de Janeiro. And of course, the place was absolutely full. People were in the windows, everybody wanted to hear Jean-Paul Sartre. And the first thing that Sartre said, and Sartre was not a polite person, he said the things directly. And his first thing, before saying hello, good morning, or whatever, he said, "And where are the Black people? I don't see them." Now, 50 years later, it was the same situation. So 3 years later, they invite me again to supervise a case of the first Black psychiatrist in the association, Psychiatric Association of Rio Grande do Sul. And there were 2 cases of Black people in a hospital, psychotic patients. So, I mean, things slowly, very slowly are changing, but I was very, very, very happy and very proud to be invited to this. And the case was great, of course, but yes, as you said, it's so easy to the exclusion, the exclusion is so engraved in our unconscious, and we don't even notice that, no? And that's, and just to finish, one more question. What do you think about the participation of psychoanalysts in the public debate?
Well, that is a good question. I think in our theories, I think as a clinician, I see that work as being some of the challenge of what we have to figure out how to do literally in the room with our clients, with our analysts, right? The way that you describe that case, how you work with that young man to understand his own whiteness, not whiteness, right? But I think in our theories, in our insights, here, why I think our theories are so helpful. It's a stereotype of psychoanalysts that we care about the individual, not the social. But that's not true. That's why I loved what you said about the subjective. We very much see the subjective as a collective structure, right? The subject is not just an individual. It manifests in individual personal ways. So we have things to say about this. There's this area between the individual and the social, right? Where the subject sits, shaped by the social, but personalizing, as an individual. And that is where we are very adept at being able to talk about that. And so, in a sense, we hurt ourselves when we allow ourselves to fall back into thinking, oh, we just think of the individual. We don't do the social. That is actually not what we do. And maybe if we could speak more to that in our engagement with the public, right? That probably could be as helpful as the work that we do one-on-one in our consulting rooms,
Thank you.
I was thinking, Michelle, with what you were speaking right now, that I recall this incident that happened like this week with this Brazilian soccer player in Spain, and he was offended in the field while he was playing because he was Black. But he's a great soccer player, and I figure he plays for a great football team that is very recognized around the world. So, and I was thinking that we were talking before we started, that CEPAL, that is the psychoanalysis organization from Latin America, released a statement against violence and racism. So that's a way I think societies are trying to speak up in this kind of situation. But I was wondering, what do you think, Jorge and you, Michelle, about discriminating a successful person? Because I was thinking that when we think about racism and discrimination, we see like minorities that are maybe less privileged. But in this case, it is a privileged person. He's very successful, and he's doing a great job, and he's doing a great career in sports, and he's like very recognized, and still he suffers racism. So it's interesting to think what phenomenon happens there as a group, but also individually, that may be like envy or I don't know, like projecting aggression, but it's very like interesting to think what happens when you're discriminating someone that is also very successful in what he does, and that is like having a good place, and he's doing a good job, and still he is like suffering violence. So I don't know, what do you think about that kind of, because it's not a minority suffering, he's like outstanding in his field.
I mean, I think that the stereotypes that we carry of other people, I don't know, they're not real to the other people. You know what I mean? Like even somebody who is defined by society as a minority, the only difference from a poorer dark-skinned person and that soccer player is that that soccer player has achieved social and cultural capital, right? But there isn't anything different at some level in nature just because he has accumulated an amount of privilege, right? So all of the resentments and dissociations and feelings about who is allowed to have privilege or not will then still come to bear on, you know, the person who does not have privilege. I'm going to see them a certain way. And then if some of they're just human like me, but in my head, I've decided they are not supposed to have privilege. I'm somehow a person who can. So then when one of them actually has some privilege, it must be quite confusing because it's like, wait, in my head, you know, you should be interacting with me in such a way that either I don't see what I've decided is what a non-privileged person should look like, or if I see it, then I'm confused. And I think you named a few things here: aggression, envy, right? But for me, the problem is in how did we decide how do we decide that the way we should think about another person is based on whether, and their difference from me is based on whether they have privilege or not, right? Where did that come from, right? That idea that we're going to put ourselves in these different camps and we're going to establish very profound senses of difference on the basis of that, right? So that's one thought, that's what I thought of.
So I know a little bit about the case, Patricia, because I like football a lot, soccer, and of course I know very well Vinicius Junior. Vini Junior, he plays in the Real Madrid, maybe the greatest team in the world, and he's absolutely very, very rich, and he has a lot of power. And he's the story is more complicated. I saw the video and it was infamous. I mean, it was horrible. People from the other team shouting monkey shouts and insulting him, etc. And this became a world case because it is Vinicius. But I read, I wish I wrote it. I read an article in El País from a Black person who lives in Spain, but who is not, you know, a world famous player. And he said, what happens to Vinicius happens to people like us every day. Nobody says anything, you know, but because it was Vinicius, Lula intervened in the debate. Lula himself and a lot of people around the world. And what I want to say is that Vinicius is not a very easy person. I hate the way they were insulting him, and I think there should be very, very serious consequences because in Spain they have laws for this, and the umpire was, you know, he's very, very much responsible of this because not only he didn't do anything, he should stop the match. That's what the rules said, but he also give a red card to Vinicius because he was, you know, very aggressive. He was naturally very, very angry. And but Vinicius wrote a tweet, a long tweet, because he's very, very, very outspoken, and he said, everybody knows that Spain is a very racist country, which is true, but Brazil is a very racist country too. You know, and Peru and Chile. So, I mean, there's a lot of layers here. That's what I was trying to say. I understood your question about why a person of privilege. There is has to do a lot with fanaticism in football and violence, of course, and racism. But also it was the responsibility of the La Liga, that's the name they call the football clubs association, who try to minimize this, and the umpire. And now, because it's the Real Madrid, which is a very powerful team, I mean, they're not only very good, they have a lot of power in Spain. This is a world case, which is good, of course. But as this guy in El País said, and what happened to us who are not famous and nobody speaks about us? No? Well, so this has a lot of different layers of discussion as well.
It's like the dead letters. I appreciated letras muertas, I think you called it, when you said that, like, these that the football institution has anti-racist policies, but they're, as you said, they're dead letters. Very powerful phrase. No one is enacting them, right? So that's partly why that can happen, because they would need the same, we would need to actually believe that we have to enact an anti-racist policy because these feelings and these thoughts are so powerful that they're not being controlled. They're not controlled for the man walking on the street every day, and they're not controlled for the fancy football player. It's equivalent, right? But if there's a sense that they just sit there as words on a page, but they're not being kind of actively enacted, but that, to my mind, is a way of somehow minimizing how powerful these sentiments actually are in the people looking at the man walking on the street and looking at the fancy football player,
Yes. I have a question from the audience that I would like to make, and it's directed to both of you. So it says, what is the stance of the presenters regarding recognizing the intersectionality of issues, the intersections of colonialism, racism, sexism, classism, disability, indigenous? For example, the advertisement for the secretary example mentioned in the first presentation by Jorge Bruce is an example of racist but also sexist bias, because the serving role of the secretary is assumed to belong to the social role of a white woman at the time, and a working class woman possibly. Would it be available as a job post to a man at that time? That is the question someone.
Well, let me just say that, yes, I mentioned that in my presentation, that apparently it couldn't be a man, because there, even now, there are very little men working as secretaries, and it is considered a women's job. Yes, I think it's right that there is a lot of intersectionality there, because there was sexism, there was classism, because white in Peru, at least, always means from middle class to upper class. It's very, very difficult to find white people in the lower classes, and they are the huge part of our country. So that's what I compared Peru more with South Africa, because my friend Max Hernandez, who is a great psychoanalyst, and I think I'm very close to him. He's somebody whom I learn a lot. He called Peru Sudafrica solapa. I don't know how to translate that. Disguise South Africa, because we have apartheid in the practice in everyday life, and that example is an example of that. But even South Africa was more, consequent. They were clear. The Constitution forbids Black people to go to beaches, etc., etc. Well, in Peru, the descendant from the Indians, who are the nannies for the rich people, there's a lot of beaches where they can only bath after 5 in the afternoon, and where the other people are prevented to come. I mean, legally it's impossible, so they put a very far access to the beach, and when they finally arrive, if they walk a lot, they feel unwelcome. I mean, but this is the real life. This is not the law. And I think that's that's a dissociation, as Michelle said. And but I will leave you the intersectionality part, but you know a lot about that, Michelle.
I mean, but you picked up on some of it. I think maybe the way that I would start, often we focus in on, the way I would put it is the intersectionality of that ad is to identify who the ad wants to take the job. A white woman, right? And so there's race and gender together. And there may be other things too, as Jorge just clarified, of a certain class, to look at all the elements of who is the figure behind that ad that the ad is actually looking for, right? And then you see all the people fall off who are not included in that group, right? And so to my mind, what I don't like is when intersectionality is understood as an either or, as if somehow by identifying that the ad is looking for a person of a certain race, it means you can't, that's somehow more important, or you can't identify that it is also looking for someone of a certain gender, right? Well, why? Why does one exclude the other? When intersectionality becomes like, one thing gets rid of the other thing, I don't see why that's necessary. And so instead, maybe the way to get around that is to look at, well, what is the ad looking for? What are all the features that we know the ad is looking for? And what do we feel about? Is there a certain notion of the human, gendered, raced, classed, that the ad is secretly calling for? And can we name that and bring that into the foreground? I think I'm saying intersectionality is not about identities. It's about a method for reading what is being included, or who is being included, and who is being excluded. And the people who are being included and excluded have complex multiple identities. Intersectionality is not the name for a lot of identities. It's a name for a method of identifying how those identities interact with each other, to leave some people out and to include and pull some people in.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just crossroads, it's more than that. If I understood. Okay.
Say more. What would you? I think you have a thought there. What do you mean?
No, I was trying to understand what you mean by method.
Yes, that maybe to say it's not just the crossroads that you're standing there. The full quote is that you're standing at the crossroads and cars are coming from multiple directions. So it's the collision that's actually what she's interested in. And I've written about collisions at the intersection. And so when I say it's a method, it's a force, it's a process, I'm wanting us to look at the dynamics that are occurring at the point of the intersection, not just me standing in the intersection. I am an intersectional person. It's more about the process of what is happening at that intersection as all these forces collide. The forces of identification collide on the individual standing there, right? So in that sense, exactly, it's about the crossroad and everything that's coming into that crossroad and impacting the person.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I have other questions that maybe I'm gonna try to sum them all because they're alike, but it's like, first someone is like telling us, why do you think that some colleagues think that addressing to the social is not psychoanalysis? That's something we talked a bit earlier, but also what do you think about how could we work out this in our institutes? And if this should be part of the training programs also, how can we work on elitism, discrimination, racism? Because I think what it's implicit in these questions is that we have to be aware that our formations in our institutes are have to do with elitism also. Becoming a psychoanalyst or studying it is maybe something that could be seen as an elitist way of, not anyone can study because it's difficult, it's expensive, it's long, it's whatever. So it's also something that we have to be aware that becoming a psychoanalyst requires a lot of effort and resources. So it immediately makes a difference in for example, when you say about classism, what you were saying that most analysts are white, social, I don't know, like upper class. But how can we address these problems and these biases in our formation programs? What do you think about that, about the institutes of psychoanalysis?
What I can say is that I don't know if that's the case in New York, but you will tell us, Michelle. In all of South America, the places where the psychoanalytical societies are I haven't seen no exception to this rule, always in rich neighborhoods. Recoleta in Argentina, Miraflores in Peru. I don't know where it's in Chile, Santina. I'm sorry, Patricia. And I've been in Porto Alegre, Rio, etc., or Cordoba. I think many places. And yes, it's very expensive, and that's a very powerful filter, of course, because it is expensive. So there is this kind of non-written discrimination again, that people think, at least in my country, that this is only for people with means and that can afford to, and also there is an underlying class rate. Is very intersectional in it, and in some way. So I'm going to put an example here. Once I was asked to give a class on I think it was racism, and but a class, not a course, a class. And I was speaking to the candidates, and one candidate said, but for instance, in a very poor neighborhood of Lima, unfortunately we have a lot of them, if a woman, a mother, has a newborn child, and quoting Esther Bick, she said, and this mother looks to her baby with a loving gaze, in a loving way, and that's the only thing that matters. And I said, well, let me use your example because I think it's very, very useful. In child observation, this method of training, we should complexify the way we look at it. Maybe this mother, because I don't know, I'm not in her mind, but maybe this mother, if she's, as you said, someone that really loves her child and who is who wish the better to this person in life, maybe she has this anxiety that this little baby, when he grows up or she grows up, will have to face a very hostile world where she will be discriminated. Well, she will not have the chance of being a psychoanalyst, for instance. So maybe we should take that things in consideration, and not only that if she loves her or not love her because she's conflict or has one pathology or the other. But she lives in a real world, and she knows how the real world is. And we should address, I think, these things in our formation. And we should have in our curricula this kind of courses and situations in where, in the crossroad, to use your word, Michelle, between the social and the inner world, which Freud was always very keen to say that they are not separated, that they are never separated. I mean, when you speak of the one, you speak of the other. No, the Botellas, the psychoanalyst André Green, used to quote them about the internal object, and he said, in French is toujours dedans, aussi dehors, always inside, at the same time outside. I mean, there is no clear frontier there. And the other question, I don't have the answer, but we should have a way to, I'm not an expert in this kind of organization, but people can, I know that people are very clever that can do this. We have to find a way to include people that usually won't have access to our institutes, to our societies. Because if we don't, we will still be, this kind of segregated place, and we are part of the problem.
Yeah, I agree, and I agree with both of the moves that Jorge that you made. One, there are two things. One is curriculum, and I think by curriculum I mean, how do we help our candidates understand that whatever the race of the mother who is looking at that baby, and whatever the race of the baby, the love is also going to be carrying some of these other dimensions, right? That how the mother looks at that baby with love, presume all of them are looking at them with love, but all there are other considerations of who she thinks that baby is going to be that she loves based on their real social context, right? Helping candidates understand how to, this is what Jorge was saying about the inside and the outside, that is relevant for every single, whether it's a white mother or black mother, but it's relevant in specific lived experiences ways. And so as candidates, they need to read a piece that talks about the way black mothers, as their children get older, start getting sterner and more disciplinarian because they want to get those children to understand how to deal with a racializing world, right? That is a particular shape of the unconscious dynamic between a black mother and a black child that may not be as relevant for a white mother and a white child, but it is unconscious too. It's a part of the dynamic. Candidates need to read things to help them understand that, right? In the case, in case they have that kind of patient come into their room. So for me, that is curriculum, right? Which I think all analysts should be reading, regardless of even what your patients look like, just to understand the complexity of the human experience. But then it's true, if there are no patients coming in or candidates coming in from those other experiences, that becomes a little bit like a dead letter too. You're reading all this stuff, but you're not applying it because we become an elite profession serving an elite clientele. We have to figure out how to bring be more inclusive, have actual more clients of color and candidates of color coming in the door, right? And both those things have to happen at the same time, because if we don't change and they come, then we create microaggressions and make the environment difficult, right? So it's like both of these things have to be happening simultaneously, I think, in our institutes.
Exactly.
Well, we have a few minutes left, but I would like to make a last question that came from the audience. And it's how, in your experience, the intersectionality takes place in the transference countertransference. I know it's a big question, but maybe we can try to answer it in the few minutes we have left.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if I can use, so there is I don't know if this, I think a clinical example, I don't know if this clinical example help. It's not my own. It's from a colleague who's named Lauren Levine, who's written a wonderful book about how to think about intimacy and risk between analyst and analysand. And she tells a story in one of her chapters about, she's a white Jewish analyst in the United States. And she tells a story with a variety of patients of color, successful, African-American doctor, woman, et cetera, et cetera. And she was, and George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matters protests were happening. Also, the January 6th, invasion of the Capitol in the United States was happening, and their psychoanalysis is moving along. And the analyst, Lauren, starts to realize that there might be something that she needs to say about this, but the presumption of training is that the analyst kind of waits for the patient, analysand, to kind of bring in what they need to bring in. But it was really pressing upon her, and I'm paraphrasing her, she tells this story in her book, it was really pressing on her, and she decides to take a risk and actually just say something about her own experience, about how she's experiencing the historical moment that they're in, right? The crossroad that she is standing in as the white female Jewish analyst, right? And then ask, if that had any implications for the patient, for how they were interacting with her, right? And the patient actually I think it happens over a course of a number of sessions, both was surprised for her to raise it. The patient is a patient of color and was themselves kind of like, hadn't really thought about it, just to show you that the dissociation is not just in people who may seem white, right? Like that the patient themselves is kind of like, no, I think, no, not coming up or whatever. Patient goes home, and then the next session expresses how relieving it was for her to hear the analyst first, in a sense, quote unquote, racialize herself, speak of her own racial experience, name it, speak to what was happening historically, like bring the intersectionality into the room, right? So what does that show us clinically? That the defenses in the transference of the patient is very aware in their transference that you are a white analyst. Do not believe that any patient of color is not aware of that, right? Are they consciously aware of it? Maybe, maybe not. That's a spectrum. But unconsciously, they are aware of it. And so it is a barrier and it is a resistant. It is there in the transference, no matter what. And so this was an unorthodox move on her part, bends the frame a little bit by, putting that into the room from herself first, right? Subjectively, but it creates an intersubjective moment where the patient could reflect, it lands in the patient, they do something with it, and then she comes back and she's able to say, that had an impact on me, and it opens something up between them in the transference and in the treatment, right? That's the example that comes to mind of maybe just holding the idea of like the intersection, that the intersectionality is not the identities, it's bringing those forces into the room, into the consulting room, seeing the consulting room as the crossroad, how to do that, right? That might be the way that I would think about intersectionality and the transference together.
Let me just very briefly, because I know we are late, Patricia, give you an example where I was the victim in a very, funny way. Somebody called me by phone, and I fancy myself that I can know a lot of the people that call me just by listening to the phone. Now people don't use the phone; they use WhatsApp or whatever but at that time it was the phone. And for the way that he was a man, spoke, and yes, I remember now, the person that recommended me to this person was a secretary, and she came from a neighborhood I knew that was kind of poor, not very poor, but kind of poor. And for the way this man spoke on the phone, and then he asked me how much I ask for my session. And well, as many of us, I have, different scales. And I thought, well, this man cannot pay full, the full, what I can ask for somebody who's rich. So I give him a social honorary or something like that. That's what I become the victim. When he came to my place, yes, he was, a racialized person and all that, but he was very rich. He had a fabric of plastics or cartons, I don't know. So, but he still lived in that place, and he could pay whatever I asked. So I feel so stupid, and also it was funny, of course, no. But you see, countertransference sometimes makes this, jokes on you. What can I say? I cannot change what I said on the phone, so I have to work with that.
Yes.
It was very useful.
Jorge and Michelle, I would like to thank you very much for your presentations today and the discussion. I think it has been very interesting, and I think we have had a good time. I can tell that we were able to discuss and to interchange ideas, and I think that the audience maybe was also like enjoying. So all the questions that came up were very stimulating for our conversation. And I would like to thank also all the people that were joining our webinar, and to tell you that we will have our next webinar on June 30th on psychoanalysis and childhood. So, and also we will have there two panelists presenting the theme. And we would like you to join us also in the future IPA Congress that is going to happen in July at Colombia. So we hope most of you can join us there. So thank you very much again, and hope to see you in Cartagena de Indias.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Michelle.
Bye.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Maria.